Well, hello, everyone, and welcome today to this presentation, this panel that has been put together by OUTWORDS, also known as the OUTWORDS Archive, in honor of International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. It is our honor and our privilege to be able to present a gathering of individuals, Indigenous Americans who also identify as LGBTQ, Two-Spirit, or another term within that realm. OUTWORDS is a national collection of interviews with people whom we call pioneers and elders of the LGBTQ community and the LGBTQ civil rights movement. I want to acknowledge, as we get started, that OUTWORDS as an organization stands in solidarity with all of the world's Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that our headquarters in Los Angeles are located on the occupied traditional lands of the Tongva people, who are the past, present, and future stewards of this region. We commit ourselves and our work to developing relationships and cultural competencies to uphold and support Native sovereignty. As I mentioned, the event that we've sponsored today or put together today has three OUTWORDS interviewees, one from Minnesota, one from Colorado, and one from the San Francisco Bay Area, all of whom are Indigenous Americans who also identify as LGBTQ, Two-Spirit, queer, or another description or adjective. We are very honored to have them among us to share their own unique stories and perspectives on their journeys, both as Indigenous people and as queer people, that term used lightly. We are very anxious to convey that we, as a white American, I understand that the number of perspectives and stories of Indigenous queer Americans cannot possibly be represented or encapsulated by just three individuals and one moderator. But this is our offering to the community with hopes that you will gather something meaningful for yourself and for your own individual communities from this event. Without further ado, I want to introduce our moderator today. J. Miko Thomas is a Chickasaw writer, musician, and artivist. As drag persona Landa Lakes, she's founded two houses, Brush Arbor Girls in 2014 and the House of Glitter in 2015. Landa is also the West Coast mother of the Vogue House of Lauren International. Landa's honors include a KQED LGBT Local Hero Award and the national pageant title Jewel of the Galaxy. Landa serves on the board of Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits, co-founded the first and largest Two-Spirit powwow, and was publicly elected as the 36th Grand Duchess of San Francisco. And Landa is also, last but not least, founder of the Weaving Spirits Performance Art Festival, which will have its third gathering in March 2022, here in San Francisco or virtually, still to be determined by circumstances at this moment beyond our control. Without further ado, I would very much like to introduce Landa Lakes. Thank you so much, Landa.
Thank you, Mason. It's a pleasure to be here. Anyway, I'm coming today from the untreated land of the Ohlone people. If you're curious about what untreated means, it means when a group of people isn't considered to even exist anymore. And that's the case quite often with the Ohlone people. They're often seen as non-existing. But I'm going to go ahead and get started with our panel today. It's going to be really fun. But first, I have the pleasure of introducing Sharon Day. Sharon grew up in northern Minnesota with her Ojibwe culture, but not her religion, since it was against federal law for Indigenous Americans to practice religion until 1978 under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. When her brother Michael tested positive for HIV in 1987, Sharon helped create what became the Indigenous Peoples Task Force, IPTF. where Sharon has served as executive director since 1990. Since 2011, Sharon has led 15 water walks to bring healing to the natural world and attention to humanity's destructive effect on the environment. Sharon is also an artist, musician, and writer. She has been honored with the Red Ribbon Award for the National Native American AIDS Prevention Resource and the Alston Bannerman Fellowship Award. In 1988, the governor of Minnesota, Minnesota, not Pennsylvania, Minnesota, along with the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul, proclaimed an entire day in Sharon's honor. Sharon Day.
Sometimes people say about Two-Spirit people that we are spiritual people, and historically we were spiritual people, and we were name givers, and we were this and that and the other thing. And I like to say, you know, we are everywhere and we do everything. It was 1998, and the county and city were going to widen this road, Hiawatha, and to do so would mean the highway would be within 200 feet of the last natural spring in Minneapolis. And so people gathered to try to protect the spring, and I went because I was called to go. And that was about a 2.5-year process for me and my sister. And you know, the chief asked us at that time, what will you do for the water? What would happen if all of the women of the world said no more? And one of the elders, Josephine Mandamin, began the water walks in 2003. And 2011, I led my first walk and have led 14 of them since then. When I lead the water walks, we gather the water at the headwaters of a river, and we carry the water every day until we get to the mouth of the river. In our language, the word for love is zage, and that means to nurture, and to nurture the essence of life. And the mouth of the river, we say zagin, and that's a place where all life goes to be nurtured. Today, the mouth of the Mississippi River is a dead zone. And so when we gather that water at the headwaters, where it's still pure and clean, and we carry it all the length of the river, when we get to the mouth, we give the river a taste of herself. And we say to her, this is how you began, pure and clean, and this is how we wish for you to be again. There was a time where somebody told me that God is in the water. And as a Ojibwe woman, that really resonates with me, because water is the source of all life. And when we carry the water, when we're singing those water songs, we're speaking to the spirit of the water. And so it's my responsibility then to protect life and to protect that which brings life into the world.
Please welcome Sharon. Hi, Sharon. I have a question for you. How has your Ojibwe identity strengthened your work with youth as well as with people living with HIV?
Well, I think among our cultural values, you know, that's really what makes us Ojibwe people. And I happen to be Medewin, which is the Grand Medicine Society, and we are the people who gathered the medicines. We're also the people who, you know, medicine by itself, an equally important part of using those medicines is the ceremony that goes along with it. And, you know, we have a ceremony for everything. There's an old joke about how many Indians does it take to change a light bulb. You know, four, three to sing the light bulb changing song and one to change the bulb. But we do have ceremonies for everything. And I think that this resurgence in our culture, in our cultural ways, in our ceremonies is really, what makes us Indigenous. And also, like President Biden says, build back better, right? Well, in order to build back better, among Indigenous better, having a cultural resurgence is making sure that the society that we return to recreate is inclusive to all of us, not just men and not just women, but Indigenous queer people, everybody. So I think that, that our culture is, that's the source of strength.
Thank you, Sharon. Right now, we're going to go on to Crisosto Apache. Crisosto Apache is originally from Mescalero, New Mexico, on the Mescalero Apache Reservation. Cristo is Mescalero Apache, Chiricahua Apache, and Dene of the Salt Clan and born for the Towering House Clan, and is assistant professor of English at the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. Christos holds an MFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Christos is also the associate poetry editor of the Offing magazine. Crisosto Apache.
I grew up on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, and that's sort of located in south central New Mexico. Part of my identity is Apache, Mescalero Apache, Chiricahua Apache, which is in De. And another part of my identity is Navajo on my dad's side, which is Dene. Finding my identity, learning about who I am, learning where I come from, learning how that all fits, has been sort of a lifelong journey. And it's a journey still that I'm learning about. I mean, I don't think I'm finished trying to find out how I fit, still, because I have to think about my cultural context. I have to think about my political context. I have to think about my gender context, my sexuality. Two-Spirit is a term that many Native American LGBT people use to identify themselves versus LGBT. Because of the history, because of the identity, because of the culture, they've used that term to sort of self-identify, to sort of give them some type of empowerment about how they want to identify, and has nothing to do with the Western world. But then the term Two-Spirit doesn't fit me either, because I have cultural ties. I am a member of a tribal community. One term that I found was Ndestsan, which is the term that has a male and a female kind of put together. And it's the only term that I know of that closely resembles what I am, because of how I think of in my mind. I mean, I know now we use the word trans and, those types of terms that coincide with that. But, I don't necessarily see myself as a woman, and I don't necessarily see myself as a male. Biologically, I'm male. But how I move in my culture, how I move in my identity is very fluid. I think that who I am and how I am was purposeful. It is a gift. It's a gift for myself and a gift to my family. Because of how I choose to walk, how I choose to express myself, how I choose to look at things, look at my environment. It allows me to incorporate what I've learned into who I am. And, that allows me to understand myself a little bit better and to build better relationships with people.
Okay, welcome. So I have a question for you, and it's a two-part question. So the question starts off with, what are some of the challenges of your experience growing up on the reservation and off the reservation? And then to follow that up, why are these important to address these challenges?
Some of the things I really think about in terms of that question is how I grew up. Because I teach now, and I interact with much larger population. I sort of take that idea and sort of go back and sort of listen to what people's ideas are from a reservation. I think most of the times people have this idea that of the romantic idea of what reservations are like, or how Native American people are like. So I think having much broader conversations about that, it made me realize that the experience that I have growing up on a reservation is so different than what most people know or expect. So I think the idea of a challenge are just the perspectives that people have, and how I'm able to sort of look at that and analyze that perspective. Because how I grew up was very different, and I've learned that over time of living off the reservation. The influences from Western culture, I think, are evident on a reservation, and I see that just because I grew up there and I was born there on the reservation. The second part to that, I think it's very important to sort of address the challenges, because if I'm able to sort of identify and talk about some of the challenges of people still living and growing up on a reservation, who might have questions about their identity, knowing that there is someone out there that has sort of overcome some of those challenges and is able to talk about that without retribution or guilt or shame. I think that is really what I would like to sort of think about myself, and sort of addressing some of those challenges. And even when I do go back home, I do stand out and want to be part of the community and be part of somebody who people can look up to.
Thank you. Next, we're going to introduce Marcus Arana, also known as Holy Old Man Bull, also known as Tio. Tio is a retired gender identity discrimination investigator, policy analyst for the City and County of San Francisco, an LGBT Speakers Bureau coordinator emeritus for COAV, Community United Against Violence, and an expert witness on gender identity policies for law enforcement. Holy Old Man Bull is a bisexual transgender two-spirit who spends his days puttering in his veggie garden and spending quality time with his beloved partner, Nancy, and fellow lab, Frank. Tio is Ama Mutsun Aloni, Blackfeet, Mexican, Irish, and Scottish. Marcus Arana.
My legal name is Marcus Arana. Most people call me Tio, which is Spanish for uncle. So it's kind of a nickname and an honorific. My Native American names are several. My Blackfeet name, which is my father's tribe, is Natuinina Shtumik, which is Holy Old Man Bull. When I was given my Blackfeet name, all of the old ladies in the neighborhood were like, "Oh, that's a good name. It's got old man in it. That means you're going to live to be old. Oh, that's a good name. It's got holy in it. That means you're blessed." So what does somebody do with their gender identity when they're hiding it? Does it ever go away? Does it disappear? It wasn't until 37 that I finally came to grips with being transgender, that I even learned the word transgender. And it was at a staff meeting at Community United Against Violence, an organization in San Francisco. And one of the staff people says, we keep talking about transgender people and offering services to transgender people, but we don't have any transgender staff members, and that's a problem. And I remember kind of weakly putting my hand up sort of halfway and saying, well, I've always been a man in a woman's body, but it's my karma and I've learned to live with it. And people kind of looked at me and said, okay. You know, didn't think much of it, didn't say much of it. 2 weeks later, the same conversation happened. We say we're serving transgender clients, we don't have any transgender staff members. And all of a sudden, my arm shot up in the air. And I said, yeah, you do. I am that person. And it was like squeezing a tube of toothpaste, where you squeeze it and all this stuff comes out and you can't cram it back in. You can't unring the bell. You can't suddenly unsay the thought. In 2004, I went to do a transgender education training for a group called the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits. And I met Two-Spirit people. Two-Spirit people are indigenous people who don't fit inside the heteronormative boxes of male and female. That's the best way to describe us. We're outside the box. And so I trained this group, and after the training, I said in passing, oh, incidentally, I have Blackfeet heritage. And they got very excited, and they said, oh, you need to come to the meetings and come hang out with us and, you know, be a part of this. And I said, well, I don't know anything about my people. I know nothing about my traditions. You know, I'm a person of mixed heritage. And my friend Christopher looked at me and he said, oh, so that's the excuse you're using for ignoring your ancestors. And I thought, oh, wow, he is right. I have been so whitewashed in my own world that I completely forgot about all of these thousands of ancestors in my life. And that was a life-changing moment for me, absolutely. How has being Two-Spirit affected me? It's affected me in so many ways. I'd say probably the most profound thing is this idea that I am an absolute embodiment of masculine and feminine, and that I don't have to disavow either one. So when I changed my name, for example, I chose the middle name De Maria, which is from Mary, because I wanted to carry Mary with me wherever I went in my name. I think that for myself as a Two-Spirit person who's also transgender, I'm a great ambassador. I'm an ambassador from the Indian world to the non-Indian world. I'm an ambassador between men and women. As a bisexual person, I'm an ambassador between lesbian and gay people. So in many ways, I think that Two-Spirit people are the balancing point, and that we're a very important part of the foundation to keep everything in spiritual balance.
Hi, Holy Old Man Bull. So I have a question for you to get started. So how do you think today's conversation or discussion will aid towards change and visibility of Indigenous people, and especially Two-Spirit people?
You know, most people don't know a lot about Indian culture. And often when I talk to people, they're very surprised to learn that their stereotypes are just that. And so the more that we have these conversations that allow great people like Sharon and Crisosto and people like yourself to share their stories, I'm kind of humbled to be in the company that I'm in. I think it broadens the understanding of who we are. And hopefully there are enough Indian people who maybe aren't Two-Spirit, who are a part of this, tuning in, who are listening, who maybe never thought about us before, or maybe never understood the context of who we are in the fabric of the importance of what being Indigenous has been for all of our cultures. You know, in the Blackfeet culture, we have a waterfall named after Running Eagle, who was a great Two-Spirit warrior, female-bodied warrior, who was a chief and had many wives and won many wars. So we've always been a part of it. And these kinds of seminars, I think, expose non-Indian people to hear stories from Indian people and expose other Indian people to hear stories from Two-Spirit people that they maybe didn't hear before.
Thank you. Now it's opened up to the whole panel. So I'm going to just ask you some questions. And the first thing that I want to acknowledge too is that at this time, at this time in the world, in Canada, there's the residential schools that have found so many children who have who've been buried, and no real words came out. One of the things I would like to say about that is we've never really been silent. We've told stories similar to this, and really a lot of times it has fallen on deaf ears. So my question to you, to the panel is, on the panel today, how many people who here have been affected by boarding schools here in the United States? And can you tell me about that? I'm sorry, it's a really tough question.
I'll say something. I know from my own family and background, one of my great grandfathers, who's Asa de Kluge, did go to the boarding schools, and he went to the one in Pennsylvania. And I know that the boarding schools itself, I think, was very detrimental to a lot of Native Americans, especially in the community that I grew up in. Only because it didn't really promote cultural aspects of our culture, and it also impacted the language of our people, mainly speaking about the Apache people. And I think that not allowing that part of the culture to sort of grow, it does impact the community in a lot of ways. One thing that I am very appreciative of lately is that a lot of the programs that are being developed with our tribe is now really trying to promote language preservation and also cultural preservation, where in the school system, they're teaching the children the courses in Apache, and also talking about the culture and how the culture is embedded in part of our spirit, our being, our adolescent, and just going through life. So I know that part of the residential school system made a huge impact on just my family itself.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, I did not go to a boarding school, and neither did my parents. But my grandmother did, and there was a school at Vermilion, which is about 60 miles from our community, and my grandmother ran away from there. But a few years ago, we wrote a play with our theater group called Everything's a Circle. And we went to the first boarding school conference at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so the youth that went with me, when we got there, the first place we went to was the cemetery. And Carlisle was on a military base. So to get into where the cemetery was, we had to get special passes. And when we went in, there's a little cemetery with 200 headstones on it. And the kids jumped out of the van, and then they ran over, and then they ran back, and they said, Sharon, we need tobacco. And so I gave them each some tobacco, and then they walked up and down those rows till they found the name of a student that they wanted to put their tobacco by. And so they did that. And then when they did their performance, we included the stories of 3 elders in our community. Their stories, they were at boarding schools, and they told about how it affected their life. And one of the elders, she's a good friend of mine, and when we were gathering this information, she wrote. She didn't say very much, but I knew she had been part of the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada, and the average person received $25,000. Of course, you got more the more you were impacted. And my friend received $90,000. And when we asked her to share some of her story, she pulled out a piece of a poem that one of her cousins had sent to her. It wasn't her story, but she was comfortable with sharing this letter, this poem. And in the poem, it talks about, the lights go out. Where will the madness visit tonight? The door opens, footsteps. Where will the madness visit tonight? I mean, it just gives me chills just, saying that. But those 200 graves that were there, they were only in a cemetery for the last 20 years, maybe. But those little graves were buried by children, older children at the school. Carlisle wasn't there that long, I think 12, 15 years, but there were 200 children who died there. And it was a young girl from Alaska who was the oldest, who had the responsibility of burying these children. She buried them all over the campus. And then 20 years ago, they dug them up and they put them in this neat little cemetery. There was an old man from Alaska who was there. And after we did the show, he said he came from Alaska to take those children home. And he told a story about that little girl. And he said, every generation, we try to push forward. We try to make them better, stronger. And he said to, the kids I work with, he said, you are the best yet. He said, it would be my honor to have you raise my grandchildren. And he said some other things too, but that was, it wasn't just Canada, it's all across the United States. And we're only now beginning to find those children, who were brutalized in those homes. And, I was in a foster home for about 3 years, from the time I was 2 until I was 6. And they were just as bad.
Thank you, Sharon. So I'm going to ask another question now, and this is more directed towards what are some of the ways you advocate or educate communities who do not know or understand Indigenous identities? I believe that this was lightly touched on a little bit before, but I just want to go a little more in depth with that. What are some ways you advocate or educate communities? Would it be better if I sort of like, I'll direct it a little more towards Crisosto, because you sort of lightly touched on it before. So I'm going to go to you with this question.
Okay. I think I stand on a pretty unique position in terms of my my job, where I have an opportunity now to incorporate historical and cultural aspects in my curriculum when I do teach students. I add in some of the if we're talking about literature or creative writing, I add in Native American writers and their perspectives. And I also touch upon some of the history when we talk about a lot of the writing that we do. And when I'm teaching my composition course as part of this idea of critical thinking, I do add in some of the historical concepts of my curriculum so that at least students are aware of some of the historical aspects and even cultural aspects that come from the history. And I know that the students really do appreciate that, because after the course and even after classes where I do talk about these significant aspects, they are appreciative of that. And most of this information they don't know. So they're really appreciative that we're able to sort of talk about it. And it's also an environment where questions can be asked and discussed in a very safe place.
Thank you. I'm going to direct this towards Holy Old Man Bull. I believe you've done many panels sort of very similar to this. So I guess my question is, how important are these discussions?
I think these discussions are very important because I've seen the kinds of questions that come across from people who, like I was looking at what some of the attendees are asking, and they're asking about things like how were our identities impacted by coming out as two-spirit people among our people, you know? So I think anytime you're educating, anytime you're storytelling and sharing, learning happens. And anytime that those of us who are up here as panelists can hear from people out there about what they're thinking and they want to know, then we get to learn something as well. So it's a never a better experience for learning than to have these panels. I think of it as a talking circle, really.
Thank you. Now, I guess one of the questions that I have, and this is going to be for everybody, I'm going to start with Sharon, though, is I want to know, when did you first learn about the term two-spirit? And from learning on it, or learning the term, when did you sort of like embrace it, or have you embraced it?
Well, you know, the first gathering was here in Minneapolis in 1988, and I and a small group of people, we did that. We put that together. And there wasn't any term two-spirit then. That didn't come about till maybe 1991 or 1992. And 1990, I don't know, someplace in there. And, you know, I look at it this way, like I'm Ojibwe, you know, and in our language, you know, I think it was like 1984, something like came out. And I called my older brother and I said, what's the Ojibwe word for lesbian? And he said, I'll call you back. And he called me back in about a half hour, really quickly. And he said, Dekana Dekwe means a special kind of woman. Dekana Deneen means a special kind of man. And then he said, why? And I said, well, a friend of mine wants to know. Anyhow, we have, you know, I'm Ojibwe. All of my ancestors are Ojibwe. That's who I am. And but if I have to use an umbrella term, then you know I choose Indigenous. I'm the kind of Quay. I am that special kind of woman, right? And but if I have to use English, then I'm queer, right? I'm a dyke. That's what I want to say on my headstone. You know, she was a good old dyke.
Thank you. Holy Old Man Bull, how about you?
Would you repeat the question? Because I got so entertained by Sharon, I forgot what you asked.
When did you first hear the term two-spirit? And then the question really remains, did you embrace it?
I absolutely did embrace it. I first learned about it in the early 2000s because I had heard about the work of Bates being involved in the queer political circles that I was running around in, but really embraced it on October 19th, 2004, when I gave a training which included you and a couple of your friends. And that's when I got to really meet Bates and the Two Spirits and become a part of community. And it opened my world for me in ways that are indescribable, beautiful, flowering. I was introduced to Two Spirit Blackfeet elders. So I was able to learn about my father's family. I got to spend time on Ohlone land down near Hollister for 2.5 years. So I got to learn about my mother's family. And we held the first ever Indian Canyon Two-Spirit Society gathering down there, which was a handful of well-meaning people. We had a great time. So absolutely, I think that for me, I've always felt kind of burdened, and I appreciate what Sharon has to say about words, because like in Blackfeet, the word for a dyke is a manly hearted woman, which is an interesting way of putting it. And there are no words for transgender people in Blackfeet. And Amamutsun is almost a dead language, so it's impossible for me to know what we were called back then. But for me, I always felt uncomfortable with words like lesbian or faggot or anything else that we choose to call ourselves. And I frankly got beat up to the sound of queer being pounded into me every time I got smacked around for being queer. So that was a hard one to embrace. But Two-Spirit felt right, because I do speak English, and it felt right for me to be able to hold both essences of masculinity and femininity. Whether I was a transgender man or not, I think I would still feel that. And indeed, I'm a bisexual gay man who's married to a lesbian woman. So you can't get any more queer than that.
Thank you. I know we've already heard a little bit about your experience and how you feel more connected towards the Apache word than to Two-Spirit. So one of the things that I would like to ask is what do you think about the new words that have slowly started to be floated around, such as like indigiqueer and so forth? What's your thoughts on that?
Was that talking to me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I just want to make that clear. It's being involved in some of the Two-Spirit movements over the years. I think it's kind of interesting how a lot of the terminology has evolved, and how people are beginning to use the terminology and sort of use it to describe or to even have it be part of their embodiment. I do think it's very interesting to see that kind of evolution happening. But I think for me, I think I'm sort of evolving as well in terms of how the identity is sort of impacting me. Because I do work in a college community, and I see how a lot of the younger people are choosing to identify, and it's always a very interesting conversation when we invite that conversation into the classroom, because there's so many various different ideas, not only on gender expression but sexuality, on how people, many of the students view that, or how they describe it, or how they've embraced those parts of their identity. And I'm also glad to kind of see this idea sort of flourishing, like on a lot of college campuses. Whereas before, like 10 years ago, it was just sort of an idea that was still coming out. And now I'm beginning to see a lot of communities sort of supporting this idea of the Two-Spirit movement. And I do see a lot of conversations happening around that. And I think that's hopefully answered part of the question.
Yes, I think so. All right. So I think I can go back to Sharon, and I'm going to ask you this. And this question is, what is the most important aspect of your identity? And why is that aspect important to tell as part of your story?
Well, I think the most important aspect of my identity is really my spiritual aspect. Everything starts there. Everything ought to start there. And if in fact, more people were connected to, that spirit, what does love live? Love lives in the spirit. And if we were really able to connect there and to act from that place, the world would be a much better place. And something I just found out recently that was quite so beautiful. Like when we're at inception, our brain cells actually begin in our heart. The heart's the first organ, and our brain cells, and we still have brain cells in our heart today. And so Yeah, I think, the spiritual part of me is the most important to stay in touch with, to stay connected um, to try to be in that place. And, when we did when we do a water walk, that is an extended ceremony, and it's really meditation being silent and listening to, the birds and the horses and, watching that butterfly, there's kind of mesmerizing as they sort of move ahead of us. And that's what we're trying to do with the walks, is really to get people to that place. And then on top of that, I think would be like our cultural values. If we all practice, those, our nation, our tribal nations values, the world, our native societies would be very different too, because they would be inclusive, as they once were.
Yes, thank you for that. Julio Mambo, same question. What's the most important aspect of your identity?
It's ironic, funny, because when you asked that of Sharon, the word that popped into my head was spirit. Above all else, spirit. That I personally am driven by that need, that sense, that understanding that this is just a body, and that we're given these lifetimes to do good things and to do good works and to make everything better than we found it. So that's my guiding principle. The most important identity I have is spirit with a purpose.
Well, in that case, let me ask you a follow-up question to that.
Okay.
Since you're talking about, like, your spirituality and everything, and there's been so many different things that have assaulted, like, Native people and especially like the Ohlone people. So someone asked earlier, what helps you to lean fully on your humanity? So with all the atrocities that goes on, how do you still find this spiritual balance?
It's really hard sometimes, because I'd be a liar to say that I haven't had moments of great anger for what happened to my ancestors. And the story of California Indians and Ohlone people is particularly sad, given how we were invaded by the Spaniards, forced into missions, which were our residential schools, and enslaved for many, many years, and then hunted down by the Americans when they discovered gold. So, you have to believe, first of all, I have this understanding that my ancestors went through far harder things than I've ever been through. And I lean upon that as strength. And I lean upon that as a way to carry through trying circumstances for myself. And to remind myself that, that we have to live in the present and deal with what's going on. San Francisco isn't going to be given back to us in the near future. So we have to find places still where we can go and pray and be on our land. So it's a struggle. Absolutely.
Yes. So when we're talking, Crisosto, about your people back home and everything else, could you tell me how would be the best way to describe your community, especially in relations to Two-Spirit people?
I think that's for me. I mean, I know that the idea of queer people exist on a reservation, and I've seen that from the time I was a kid. And then also having conversations with my mother, she used to tell me stories of people she knew when she was growing up. So this idea of Two-Spirit, I think for me, is a very new kind of term and discussion, because even before I was introduced to the term Two-Spirit, the term Birdash came up to me when I started college back in the early 90s. And at first, I wasn't really sure what the conversation was about. So I naturally did go look up the word Berdache and found what the meaning is behind that, which seemed to be a very negative definition for that term. But it wasn't later until I realized, that there was a two-spirit concept out there, which I wanted to know more about. So growing up, I started listening to these conversations with my mother and trying to make sense of what these stories were about, how people sort of represent themselves in the community. And I sort of started questioning that about myself, like, how am I supposed to be, how am I supposed to exist? How am I supposed to carry myself? When I left the reservation, I then, I grew up with the term gay, homosexual, faggot. I knew that the terms around that. So I started questioning those same terms within myself. And later came to just kind of accept the idea that I was gay. That was just the generality or the conclusion I came to. But for some reason, that just didn't settle right with me, because it felt like something was still missing. And when I was introduced to the term two-spirit, I felt like I was getting closer to what it was that I needed to sort of associate with. And it was only recently, like in the last 5 to 7 years, that I came upon the term Ndesan, which again felt more appropriate because it had a cultural tie. It had a linguistic tie. And that goes back to when these interactions and these conversations with my mother about what she was describing to me while she was growing up and what I witnessed as I grew up on the reservation, it then began to make sense to me in terms of like what I am now comfortable defining myself as. But I think it's still challenging for a lot of reservations to have support systems in place for people who are still trying to figure themselves out, how to have these conversations. Because I know where I come from, there's a huge religious influence still in our community. And I think that there's still some misunderstandings of how people can be supportive of those communities.
I think that's a very important element to think about is that aspect. So it makes me go to Sharon now. What spiritual teachings would you like most to pass on to younger Native kids?
So I'm a Daywin, part of the Grand Medicine Society, and when I was in the lodge once, and the chief started talking about, this lodge is a place of love. Love is what's important, and so this lodge is open to everyone. And he continued on that, and he said, and finally said, men, women, people of any persuasion. Whoa. And so we had a break in. We went outside, and I said to a friend of mine, was somebody talking bad about me? And she started laughing. She said, no, silly. Something one of the road people had said, and he was correcting that. It wasn't about you. And I'm like, oh, okay, good. And when we went back in, he continued on with that. And he said, in the creation story, and if you all understood the language, you would know. He said that in the creation story, when the creator created the earth, after the sun and the moon and all the planets were in place, and that was with a single thought. He said, well, then when the creator was thinking, where should I plant that first seed of life? He turned to herself, and she said, life can only be created with love. And he said, and if you knew that, you would know that. So he turned to herself, and she said, and I think that's just so beautiful. So like, if we knew our creation stories, if we knew those things, everybody would know that. I want to say one thing about policy. My reservation created a policy back in the early 90s, putting sexual preference as part of the protected classes. And I can tell you that has made such a difference on my reservation. You know, we've had people who are from our reservation who are police officers, who are, you know, there's a wonderful short video somebody made. It's a big poster over the tribal. It makes a difference what those policies are. And I think if that's one thing that, you know, every single one of us should advocate for is on our reservations, that we are every bit as much protected as males, females, you know, whatever's in those protected classes, we need to be there. And that will make a difference. And now you see all these young people from my reservation, like it's not even a thing, you know, like it's just who they are. So I think that's very important. Thank you.
Thank you. So Holy Old Man Bull, this one question that seems to come up a lot is, for those people who want to be an ally to the Two-Spirit community, how can they do that?
You know, from my perspective, allyship means coming to understand the needs of the community, coming to help without taking over, stepping up, but not being, you know, the center voice of everything. Every community needs allies. I think that there's so much cultural appropriation that goes on with Native American culture that a lot of Two-Spirit people are very touchy about the word being co-opted by people who aren't Indigenous. And so out of respect for people who may feel sensitive about that, I would ask people who aren't Indigenous not to necessarily use that word, since it seems to be something that's very important to a lot of us. And, you know, there are so many organizations that need help. Native American nonprofits can use money. And there's all sorts of organizations, and there's all sorts of Two-Spirit organizations like the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirits that are nonprofit organizations that could benefit from financial support. So there's many ways that you can help, from putting up chairs at a Two-Spirit powwow and carrying out the garbage to writing a check.
Thank you. Crisosto, I have a question for you now. And this is going to be a really difficult one, I think. So how would you respond to a person who is trying to reconnect to their culture, and they also want to use the term Two-Spirit? What's your thoughts?
I do think that is a very difficult question, and it can be a very touchy one. Because what if a person has been lost from their culture or have been detached and want to reconnect? It's very hard to do that if you are not really familiar with where you come from. A lot of times I know that there are many tribal offices or tribal governments that do keep records of families. And that might be a really good place to start. Or even trying to get in touch with maybe if you know your lineage to maybe start there as well. I was having a conversation with friends a couple of weeks ago about, because we were talking about genealogy. And one of the things, and I know this might just be kind of crazy, but the Mormons have a really good database for keeping track of family lineages. And during this conversation, we were talking about how you are able to go to that database and begin to start doing some research and at least begin to discover some of the family's history and lineage where you come from. And I know that has been very helpful for a lot of people who have been seeking out family. But I think also maybe just allowing yourself to sort of just integrate into that community. Because if you don't really try, then you won't really get anywhere trying to reconnect with family. And from what I know, that a lot of Native American families or people that I have come into contact with are very appreciative to kind of stumble across family and reconnect. And I know that there are people that are out there doing that. And I don't think that the intention is to sort of shun people away, because one of the things that many Indigenous communities think about is that there are numbers of communities that are dwindling because they are not reconnecting with family.
Thank you. Now I'll let everybody know that, you know, one of the things that helps to keep me healthy, I think, is that I picked up one thing from my grandfather from when I was a child. He would get up pretty much at the break of dawn when the sun rose, and he would sing a song and he'd do a prayer. And that was just how he started his day every day. He didn't instruct me to do it. It was just something that he always did. So I just followed suit and I did that. So I'm going to ask each of you, what is one healthy thing you do for yourself that keeps you healthy? What is one thing that you do that keeps you healthy? And we'll start with Sharon.
Oh, I think the songs too. We have so many of our songs are, really ancient. And like I said, if there's a ceremony for everything, you have ceremony, you have songs. And so there's so many songs. And even today, like we're making new songs all the time. And my family, we're all singers. My dad composed many songs, but he could tell you when he sang a song, whose song that belonged to. It would be like, this is your grandpa's rabbit dance song, or this is your uncle's, song, and he would sing them. And so songs, I think, like the first thing babies do is they make sound, right? And so songs, are for everything. So I love to sing, and I love to I like to make songs too. So I agree with you. Thank you.
Sorry, Holy Old Man Bull, what is one practice that you do that keeps you healthy?
I grow my own vegetables. I grow the sisters, so I have beans and squash and corn growing in my backyard, and and tomatoes, and that puts me in touch with the dirt and the soil and the sun and all the animals that live out there that are a part of it. And it's such a string back to my ancestors. I can just know that we have been doing this since the beginning of time. It's so familiar to me. So that makes me very rooted and makes me feel good, makes me feel very good.
That's great. Just between us, the one thing that I don't miss is hauling water, because when I was younger, I used to have to haul water because we didn't have running water.
Right.
So we had a well, so we'd have to get the water and then we had to carry it everywhere. So I think it's great that you have a lovely garden and everything, but that's the first thing that goes through my head is like, I don't miss hauling water.
When I was living in Indian Canyon for 2.5 years, that's the only way I could garden, was to carry the water in. So I feel you.
All right. Crisosto, what about you? What is one practice you do that you feel keeps you healthy?
Well, I think if you're Indigenous, you have to carry water. I remember as a kid, we did that. But one thing that I really try to consider every day that I'm awake, or maybe even when I'm sleeping, is this idea of remembrance. There's so much energy and power in this idea of remembrance, because this idea of remembering gives memorial to everybody that has gone before us and everybody that has influenced us. So every moment I get or have, I appreciate that idea of remembrance.
Thank you. There's a question for Sharon. You mentioned about the many rituals within Indigenous culture. Is there a ritual to affirm two-spirit identity among the Ojibwe?
Well, when I came out, I had a party. I got to name myself, and I think, my family thought I was a little, like, why is she doing this? But it felt really important to me to do that, and I say, if there isn't something, we make it, right. So yeah, I made mine.
Thank you. I guess my naming ceremony sort of made mine too, because my name is Butterfly Medicine, which wasn't the most macho thing to have. It was not the most macho thing to have growing up.
Some of my transgender two-spirit friends have gone through naming ceremonies to change names that were given to them when they were one gender to a more appropriate name. So that's one ceremony that some people do.
I believe that we're getting close to wrapping up. So I don't know if there's any more questions. There's a lot of there's a lot of love being sent on some of the chat, so that's really nice to see. But I guess I'm gonna sort of wrap this up with just talking about like one thing that maybe you want to share with people, that you wanted to come on tonight specifically maybe to talk about one thing. If you have not talked about that yet, now's the moment to do so. Just start talking when you're ready. Oh, you've said everything that needed to be said. No, Sharon? Yes.
I just want to say, I really encourage everybody to contact, the President and Secretary Deb Haaland to stop line 3, and in fact to stop all the pipelines. Today they came out with a report that this is like code red for the environment, and we don't have any place else to go. This is where we live, and we need to protect the environment. So I encourage everybody to. It doesn't take too long. Send the president a letter. Send Governor of Minnesota a letter. Stop line 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Marcus, do you have anything you want to impart?
No, I think my relations have said everything that needs to be said.
All right.
I do want to send alohas to all of the folks that from Hawaii that have been sending love.
Thank you. Crisosto, any last thing you want to leave with everyone?
I think this has been said before, but just to reiterate, to go and support the Two-Spirit organizations that do so much work for many of the communities out there, and also maybe be part of the conversations to see how they can collaborate. Because I know the conversations are still happening, the supports are still happening, and it's great to see a lot of developments that come out of that.
Thank you. I want to end with just saying a really big thank you, Sharon. You guys organizing that very first gathering in Minneapolis all those years ago. Who knew when you did that it was going to create such a huge thing. Just following next week, I'm going to be going to Montana, where we're going to have a Two-Spirit gathering. And the great thing about those events, at least nowadays, is like it's our opportunity to get together and talk about things that are happening in our community, and to talk about things that we want to see changed. And it's also such a safe space for Native people, that we can all come together and we can discuss our community amongst ourselves, because sometimes there are times and opportunities when Native people just need to be with other Native people. And that's one of the things I appreciate about it. So I appreciate you so much for being one of the people that helped organize that from the very beginning. And I'm glad to be involved within the Native community, especially within the Two-Spirit community. And I think my grandfather and my father for all of that, because they set me on a road where I'm going today. And Sharon, you've created a branch on that road. Holy Old Man Bull, Crisosto, just keep doing what you do, and remember, your roads also intersect with so many other people's. And that's the way that we look at it in Chickasaw culture. We sometimes refer to everything as the path or the way. And those are our ways of thinking about how to live our lives. And so I just want to end in my part with saying Chugmashki, which means in Chickasaw to make things good. And that's usually a way of saying thank you, but Chugmashki also is a command to do good things. So I'm thankful to each and every one of you. Thank you.